Welcome to our Nation State Dialogue series. राष्ट्र राज्य संवाद श्रृंखला में आपका स्वागत है. I'm Dr. Geeta Kochar, moderator for today's discussion. Today it's our pleasure to have with us Dr. Zorawar Daulet Singh, who has written extensively on China. He's an historian by discipline and an Adjunct Fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies. Dr. Daulet Singh is a founder member of Educate India Society and a member of the governing body at the Northcap University, a state private university located in Gurugram, Haryana. He has published several works, and one of his remarkable books was Power and Diplomacy, India's Foreign Policy During the Cold War, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2019. Today, we have invited him to discuss the latest publication, Power Shift, India-China Relations in a Multipolar World. Very warm welcome to you in this Nation-State Dialogue series. First of all, let me congratulate you for a very timely addition to Indian scholarship on China. And let's begin by knowing a little bit about your book, especially you're talking about the power shift in your title. So what are you basically referring to?
Thank you, Dr. Kochar. Honor to be at this particular program of yours and for supporting this and other types of work. So just a brief backdrop about the book. I've been engaging for quite a while now, for the past decade, even more on India's foreign policy and India-China relations. And I felt it would be interesting to bring some of that to a wider audience. So that was the initial impetus for the book. Of course, we've had a series of border crises. The last one particularly, I think, is now prompting more and more people outside this space of India's foreign policy to also ask questions, learn a bit more about the intricacies of India-China relations. So I think that kind of made it even more timely. For me, I think what made it also compelling was the relationship is not just something that's happened suddenly, these changes. There are broader shifts, what I call power shifts, that have been occurring for the past decade, certainly since 2012, 2013, where you had sort of this transition from a unipolar to a multipolar world order, both because of the relative decline of, let's say, the dominant powers in the West, but also the rise of Asia. China, of course, is a very central part of this. And for some reason, perhaps not surprising, but we can get into that. In this phase has seen a series of mini crises between India and China as China is sort of expanding its interest in attention to its entire periphery. India, being a major neighbor, has also sort of rubbed against this rising Chinese power. So you've had these series of mini crises that have been playing out, and each one more severe than the other. So what this phase has done is it's sort of bookended 3 decades of general stability and tranquility that we were generally presented with in the India-China relationship, the period that started from the end of the Cold War right up to, let's say, the early 2010s. So I think it's also interesting to see how we are at a new phase of the relationship, and it's coinciding with a new phase in world politics. So that was really the essence of the book. I think the book began, of course, before the Ladakh crisis, which spiraled out of control briefly in June of last year. And as it broke out, I felt that there was also a necessary to try and give a background to the history of the border dispute, try and give that context and history, because there's 7 decades of this legacy, and perhaps even a century before that of British-Indian period, which has left certain things sort of in flux, and there's uncertainty. There was ambiguity, those frontiers, in a sense, and we till this day are sort of, let's say, paying the price of this instability and this ambiguity in our frontiers for the last century. So I thought it'd be good for readers to also get that backdrop, because it's not suddenly something that happened in 2020. And it has that past to it as well, which I felt could be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about the border conflict, which is really a problematic thing, an irritant in our relations, whether we want to, move away from the border thing and talk about economic and trade relations. We are, again, I mean, 2020 is, a very good, thing to gag at and see that, we are stuck with this border problem. We cannot just move our relations without dealing with it. And so when we're talking about the negotiations, in your book, one of the things which really, strike me is that you have given a detailed account of a conversation between China and Soviet Union after the India-China skirmish in 1959. And I quote what you have pointed out is Mao Zedong's statement that the McMahon line with India will be maintained and the border conflict with India will end, will be decided through negotiations. But even after the decades, what we see is that despite negotiations, we have worst escalations, and 2020 is one of the good point to start with. So in your opinion, what went wrong in these decades?
Yeah, that's again, it tells you how far back we're going. You spoke about events in 1959. So I think one of the things that you find very intriguing when you look into this subject is that neither side has really tried to settle the dispute in all these 7 decades. They began in the 1950s by skirting the issue, pretending it would go away. Then in 1959, you have this flare up at the frontier. You have problems in Tibet. You have both countries, in a sense, having gotten caught up in the storm of the Cold War. And there was definitely, despite that, still, despite all these headwinds, there was a brief moment to settle the question, or at least, if not settle, meet some sort of an common understanding on a framework to settle this. And you've heard of some of the viewers of the famous negotiations that occurred in, let's say, April 1960, and the possibility of a solution on the status quo, that is the positions that were held at the time. So it just somehow couldn't take off. The environment was toxic. There was a rising nationalism, suspicion on both sides, and you want to call it an opportunity lost, or it just wasn't picked up. And then you have this phase after 1962, the frontier kind of goes silent, both militaries withdraw. They don't come into proximity for many decades after that. So this phase is kind of a phase of, let's say, not a Cold War entirely, but indifference, really. There is, you could say, verbal hostility, diplomatic hostility, but there's no real interaction or major crises that occur other than one or two. You see also by the late 70s, the post-Maoist leadership is coming to place. Deng Xiaoping has trying to sort of re-steer China's foreign policy, its integration into the international system. So what's interesting about this period is I'm coming to the context of this border dispute negotiation. So you see another possible opportunity that comes in the late 1970s, specifically in 1979, when the Indian Foreign Minister, Atal Bihari Vajpayee at the time, visits and has this landmark meeting with Deng Xiaoping, and Deng offers a solution based on the status quo. That is, Arunachal Pradesh stays with India, Aksai Chin stays with China, and sort of the frontier is more or less finalized. Maybe there could be minor alterations, which Deng said could be settled to the negotiators to finalize. Again, that framework, which from today's context seems pretty interesting and attractive, right? But it was not picked up. It was left, I suppose there was too much of the emotional and the trauma of the 50s and 60s that Indian policymakers continued to sort of hold on to. And successive governments in the early 80s could not pick on the Deng Xiaoping model for the... So what we really have is by the late 80s, both sides recognize that there's a thawing in the Cold War. They need to stabilize and normalize their relationship, but they can't make any concessions. So they arrive at this sort of unique modus vivendi where they say we're going to sidestep the border question and attempt a thawing of the relationship. So you have this parallel framework that's developed. It has sort of three pillars: that there'll be peace and tranquility on the frontier. There'll be sort of talks on a final settlement, which were open-ended. It had no end game. And you had an agreement or an understanding that both sides will incrementally develop ties in other areas like economy, people to people, interdependence, the kind of culture of the international system that was undergoing changes by the 70s and 80s as the world was becoming more globalized. So I think that framework has stayed right until the past decade. And it's what's happened is, as the Indian and Chinese militaries have becoming more stronger in a sense and are reasserting their footprints and their border management, they are again coming back into contact, similar to what happened in the late 50s, in a sense, early 60s. So you are this time again faced with so many people have drawn these parallels, like we're entering or have in the last 5 years, another phase of intense competition and something needs to come in between some sort of a political device to buffer this, because after all, you are nuclear weapon states, you're pretty formidable conventional military powers. The possibility of confrontation holds much more severe consequences than it even did in the past. So now in retrospect, I suppose we can ask the question, what went wrong in all these decades? I think for one is, which I'm sure some other observers have also noticed, is I think neither India nor China have really evolved a geopolitical outlook to accommodate the other in their foreign policy. For China particularly, I think India has really been a piece of a broader geopolitical canvas or a dilemma of resisting pressure from the United States. It was never important in its own right. It was one part of an entire periphery that needed to be managed. I think the Chinese also kind of drew upon some of the legacy and the British colonial period policies that colored their outlook to India. Because a lot of the British Indian policies, as we all recall, if you go back to the 19th, early 20th century, were to use India as a base to dominate not just India, but the entire Asian mainland, including China. So I think they tended to see modern India, post-1947 India, as more or less a continuation of that type of an Indian role that would play. And despite everything that the Indian leaders would try and say or do, I think that belief has remained pretty strong, I would say, even till the present. I think for India, the emergence of modern China, its rapid descent into Tibet in the early 50s, was again something that we have not really ever been adjusted to. I think it was such a shocking development in 1949, 1950, 51. We continue to, in a sense, are adjusting to China's rise, right? You talk of China's rise in the last 10 years. I think it's the last 70 years, we're still somehow finding ways to adjust to this large new neighbor that has suddenly come onto the scene after a very prolonged period of indifference or separation, right? Tibet was more or less uninhabited. The Qing power never really entered into South Asia. So they were looking in different directions. So this looking towards each other is a more recent phenomenon. And again, these inherited ideas. So I would say we have a long and fluctuating history of conflict management and tentative diplomacy, but we've never had an overarching plan for a geopolitical understanding. So in a sense, what I'm saying is this is a critique of both Chinese and Indian policymakers. It's always been to manage the relationship and not arrive at some sort of an understanding of what it means to be part of this Asia and both strong independent entities. And they've been fleeting moments when they've tried to sort of present an alternative narrative, a narrative that goes beyond the tactical, beyond the immediate, to say that how can we are going to exist like the way the European nation states exist. We are there to stay now. Let's now try and find a framework to coexist. I think that hasn't really taken off, and it's been too transactional, too competitive to just deal with very, very immediate security problems. So that strategic mindset, and here I would even critique the Chinese statesmen in a sense, because we're often told that they have this long view. I haven't really seen a long-term India policy also. Many haven't from them, right? It's always that let's keep, this is a nuisance, this is an irritant, but it's they haven't been able to really accommodate India or socialize India into a more multipolar world order.
Yeah, I mean, precisely. I think, what I was looking at in ETs was something like a framework of a neo-functional approach where you will have economic and trade relations, and gradually the border problem will on its own get diluted, and probably, the solution would not be required. Maybe the thumb shopping model of status quo would be acceptable to both sides. And it didn't really work. And you're very right, I mean, it's the problem on both sides where, you're not able to accept the realities of a very rising power, which is suddenly there. And China hasn't been really, really enough framework of what needs to be done with India. India is always a problematic thing, an irritant. And maybe you're right in terms of, the British colonial mindset of thinking that, it's something which tries to hegemonize South Asia and now wants to expand and hegemonize the whole of Asia. But let's move a little beyond what China is doing in terms of, the BRI we've been talking about, and you've written in your book as well, that China has shifted its locus of strategic power away from the oceans to the continental heart of Eurasia under the Belt and Road Initiative project, while India still carries the Mahanian view of maritime power. Can you elaborate a little bit on what you're implying when you're talking about the Mahanian view of maritime power and how they're going to deal with each other?
Yeah. So I think to begin with, I think we must recognize that India and China are both continental and maritime powers. In a sense, they're not unidimensional in their geopolitical reality and orientation. So because of that, they will have more complex geostrategies where land and sea matter for security, for trade, access to resources, connections to other states. In fact, if we look at the long span of history, the connections between India and China and the areas around them through the seas was always more prominent than through land. I mean, if you look at all the major interactions that occurred, it was through the Indian Ocean, through the South China Sea, and the maritime networks today are still underdeveloped and haven't recovered from the kind of interactions that they were said to have 1,000 years ago. So that's one sort of point. I think for India, what I was trying to sort of bring across is there's this new maritime thinking of the past decade. I mean, I'm using Mahanian as sort of a metaphor for that, by suggesting that this concept was really developed for island states like the United States, the British, Japan, maybe Australia, who are states that do not face the challenge of continental spaces around them. They're islands in a sense. By adopting that sort of a worldview or a concept for a geostrategy, which I'm not saying the Indian establishment or Indian policymakers have entirely adopted it, but it's emphasized more in a variety of proclamations and pronouncements. I think by adopting that worldview, India cannot formulate a sophisticated geostrategy that can account for, let's say, the long and increasingly militarized land frontier with China, or the still underdeveloped lines of communications that we used to have with Greater Eurasia, whether through Iran to Central Asia. So those facets of our geography, our relationship to the Eurasian heartland, the mainland, is something that will get neglected if you were to completely uncritically adopt a Mahanian concept. So that's the point that I'm trying to make. I think the other the risk with adopting a Mahanian concept is that the irony here is that India and China have the least amount of, in a relative sense, competition in the maritime space, right? I mean, it's all land-based, really. The maritime competition is between the United States and China in the Western Pacific and where US allies are. So by India kind of going or simply picking that up, you are just opening up another arena for competition or precipitating something that need not happen in a sense. So that's the other caution that I'm suggesting, that you need to have a slightly more sophisticated outlook, and you're separated from Sino-American problems by 2,000 miles, right? So how do you enter that particular problem? Why would you want to be a part of that when you already have a fairly large continental problem? So I think that's something which, and I think this is recognized by parts of the Indian establishment think tanks, but yet we are still sort of not able to develop our own geopolitical framework in a sense. So that being said, I think my book also makes the case for strong maritime connections with East Asia. So it's not to say that you pull back or you neglect the larger Western Pacific. It's just that you got to have it in a multi-directional sense, something that we had developed that is in the Indian civilization, the Chinese, the Indonesians, the Vietnamese, the Iranians. You had a far more organic geoeconomic networks that were there before the Europeans come on the scene in, let's say, the 15th, 16th century, carving up Asia into these exclusive zones. So the idea of exclusivity and spheres of influence is not an Asian phenomenon. It's something that we was bequeathed to these states. And I think India and China both inherited that attitude, which they need to give up on somewhat, Of course, your core zones on your periphery, you will care about. But to adopt European concepts will then just replay some of the European rivalries, which don't need to be played out in that same sense. If you get a sense of what I'm trying to say. So the book is a call for openness, deeper links with Asia and Eurasia, but which are developed on ideas, histories, and concepts that are rooted in India. So that's the essence of what I'm suggesting in the book.
No, but when you're pointing about, that it's the US problem, I mean, basically the Indo-Pacific that you're talking about is not the India's problem, which it wants to create as one of the, another angle to it, which might be a little more tricky when we will have to deal with China. But talking about the larger, the geopolitics that's happening, and you're also talking about the power shift, you just mentioned about the multipolar world. China is one country which I have studied a lot, and I always feel that it has been focusing on America for decades. I mean, especially after 80s, the whole focus has been on US, and they're doing that. I mean, the sense of economic prosperity or in the lifestyle. Now, of course, the military might. So China has always focused on something called as G2, the group of two countries, where is US and China, and not really thinking about other Asian powers. Especially when President Xi Jinping actually called about the major power relations, he was literally referring to US and China relations, and of course some other new countries into it, but definitely not India. Now, though, we see the US-China in a very adversarial relationship, yet we are of one of the view that India is seen as a strong pole in the Chinese worldview. What are other major actors you see will redefine this world order? I mean, how would that power shift will happen?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think a lot of this idea of a G2 is something that we inadvertently also try and elevate, right? We give so much importance to that it kind of dominates our way of thinking, and we're not able to look at the rest of the landscape, so to speak. But let's first look at the US-China relationship somewhat, because whether we like it or not, the rest of Asia operates in that context where there is some sort of dynamic between these two major powers that is playing out, and it's going through those power shifts, so to speak. So I, in fact, have a long chapter on US-China ties where I underscore how critical it is for India's policymakers to interpret those trends accurately. So, and rhetoric and noise on the US-China relationship, as we've seen even in the last 5 years, can sometimes disguise a more complex dynamic that's been playing out. It's not playing out like the first Cold War. There's something else happening. These are two powers that still have a lot of interdependence. They don't have any direct disputes or a major front line the way that the Soviets and the Americans had in Europe. It's a little more complex to that. Having said that, there is no doubt that there is going to be a contest or competition between the United States and China. What I'm suggesting, and the way I interpret it, is not going to be as ideological, but it's going to be for shaping institutions, even leadership over the international system, and control over globalization. So a lot of it is material in a sense, and how you shape the way the global economy functions. You've got to do it through norms and ideas. So there is going to be some ideological battles that are waged, but it's not an existential conflict of civilizations or models in that sense, even though it's presented like that. Because the Chinese model, as we know, what is the Chinese model, right? The Chinese model has gone through so many changes that it's partly, well, it's also, it's East Asian. There's a whole lot of stuff happening out there. So which particular facet of that China brings to bear in the international sphere is the one that you will end up interacting with. And they've shown themselves to be quite sophisticated in how they deal with, let's say, Europe or Africa or Asia. I don't think they're going to go into a very, very sort of a straight-jacketed approach, which is what they are at least resisting. But having said that, the possibility of US-China competition to grow because the US monopoly over the rule-making process has been broken. So in that sense, so that's one. I think what we're also seeing is when we look at US-China relations, I'll spend a little more time on that because we are still developing our foreign policy based on some sort of a forecast on where this is heading. So I think we should still look at it as very regional in its geopolitical terms. I don't think the US-China competition in the non-economic spaces has gone to a global level everywhere at the same intensity, right? It's still mainly in the Western Pacific, still on China's periphery, still on areas where China still feels it has core sort of interests. So that's something to also look out for, because we are kind of sort of forecasting or anticipating it happening everywhere. Like, for example, even in South Asia, I think it's interesting how they have limited their competition, US and China. I don't think they've gone beyond a certain point. And one of the reasons which I also bring out in the book is because they have certain common images on what South Asia should look like, right? They see India there, but they also see Pakistan, both allies of China. They don't want to see an India becoming a hegemon. So there are a lot of common aspects here, which are ironical, despite all the other competition that's happening between the US and China. In our region, there is a tacit sort of, let's say, an overlapping interest, so to speak. The reason I say that is because when we say that we're going to leverage the United States to offset Chinese power in South Asia, I would pose the counter question: where has that been done effectively, right? Have we still seen it? So, and the part of the reason is not because of a lack of clever diplomacy. It is that interests of the United States and China and India are very complex in this region. And India sometimes forgets that because it's the geopolitically dominant power, it may not see common ground even with a balance of power sort of partner with the United States. So the US wants to see India play a greater role in the Western Pacific, further east. So while for us that's not our core interests are in the subcontinent. So how do you sort of get pulled, and are you able to sort of convince others to sort of adhere to your conception of geopolitics? That's some of the I think when we look at the G2 and something which we want to avoid, or at least give it a more broader perspective, I would say the other powers are quite clear for us. We have Russia, we have Western Europe, we have Iran, we have Vietnam, Southeast Asia, Japan. I think all these are going to be pillars of a more balanced, plural, multipolar world order. And if we have strong ties with these regions and states and institutions or supranational institutions, we will, in a sense, dissuade the Americans and the Chinese from trying to solve questions by themselves. Because at some point, they will just tower over the rest of Asia and Eurasia and might just find it easier to deal with each other. And as a consequence, the other states lose out or don't get that voice. So I think we should be wary of just only looking at this triangular sense of US, China, India, but starting to develop others, because our power asymmetry with China is now widened to a point where I don't think we're going to be sitting on the same table on every issue and being heard as effectively if we don't have other partners with us. So I see the India-Russia relationship also as very vital and critical here, along with India-Japan, because these are the two long-term sort of civilizational powers on China's periphery along with us. And we must have a long view on that, because they will never want any kind of a G2 or a G1 in Asia.
Yeah, I mean, more than half a decade back when I was in China, the Chinese were looking at the governance system as what you're really pointing out. You know, they had really thought about the institutions, the rule of law, the way the human rights function. All of these things have become more significant for the Chinese to rethink about world order. And I think India is not really there to, reshape all of that. At least Chinese are not giving that, significance to India. And I really don't know whether US is really putting India at that platform or not. But having said that, and really looking at all of that geopolitical things, which you really pointed out, I mean, Russia, of course, is one of the, significant factor. I mean, today when we're talking about this discussion, it's already 1 year of Galwan incident. So looking at that, I mean, I would be very interested to know from you about the new equilibrium that you've been talking about. I mean, what is the, new shape that India and China relations will have in future, or will they be defined as adversaries forever, or there would be a congenial environment in which we would be able to reshape our relations? I mean, having said that, we have a lot of discussions ongoing about 93 is being gone, 96 agreement is really destroyed, and all of that. I mean, considering all of that has happened, I mean, what is the way ahead? How will we be looking at India-China relations in future?
Yeah, so that's a important question, and I think the temptation has been in the last 6 months or 1 year to kind of, in our exhilaration and panic, to try and sort of just throw everything from the past out and start sort of, just groping in the dark. And I think, I don't think it's going to be such a clean break, right? So now, okay, now let me get to the idea of the possibility of a new equilibrium. So I think we need to, in order to sort of address this, I think we need to look into a question that we don't often ask, or at least address properly. Do India and China have a common understanding of their differences and main areas of disagreement? And I think it seems straightforward, this question, but as the past year has shown, and perhaps the past decade has shown, they simply do not agree on the main causes of the problems. I mean, all you have to look is the public statements of the two foreign ministers. Even if you look at the last two communiques, September last year and February this year, the emphasis that each gives to certain types of questions, the Indian side focusing on the immediate, while the Chinese side focusing on the entire gamut of the relationship. And I think this sort of dichotomy or tension is something that goes back into even to the late 50s. They were never able to articulate their core problems in a common framework, because until you have a common framework, you can't have a détente, you can't have a serious strategic dialogue or accommodation. So then I would say the next question that comes is, how were they able to come to this last period of those 3 decades, right? The late 80s, because that broke the pattern. And in fact, it doesn't actually contradict what I'm saying, because even that phase of stability was not really built on a common understanding, right? It was to say that we're going to agree to disagree. I mean, that was the essence of the modus vivendi, that we're not going to let our differences and disputes come in the way of a relationship. Now, of course, in practice, it did come in the way, but they agreed to it in principle, that we will keep the border stable, it'll remain unresolved, and we'll have talks on that. But we're not going to make that a precondition for a evolution of this relationship. So let things happen on other fronts organically, let people connect, let businesses interact and trade and invest in each other. And we saw that over the next 3 decades, that model had a certain merit, right? Because if you can't solve your problems, then you're just in a stalemate and like a frozen point in time. So this had a certain open-endedness to it. It was a bit like dung shopping, right? Crossing the river by feeling the stones. It was all improvisation. There was no agreed set of guidelines. Also, let's remember the context when this happened. Both Indians and Chinese leaders were facing enormous challenges at home. You had Tiananmen happened in 89, the Cold War ends. For India too, it's a shock, the end of the Cold War. The entire political economy model has to undergo changes. Your threat environment undergoes changes. You have to now start looking out for yourself. You had a major superpower ally, which is gone and disappeared. So all this prompted India and China to start at least stabilizing the bilateral relationship and focusing on growth, development, internal aspects. I think by the late 2010s or the late 2000s, early 2010s, China was, of course, first off the block to break away from an internal domestic foreign policy. Right? All Chinese sinologists generally agree that it was the time to move beyond the dung shopping framework. That precipitated a different type of an India policy on their behalf, a different Asia policy, and that dynamic has now left the old modus vivendi under stress. So that's what we are told, right? So now, how do we replace it in light of the Ladakh crisis and a series of border crises that we've been having since 2016, 2017? We've not seen, I mean, this is the strange part in a sense, certainly from Indian policymakers or the strategic community. I don't think we've seen a clearly articulated approach of what India should adopt. I mean, we are just being told that, things need to go back to what they were, as sort of a pristine status quo, as if it was stable in the past, right? Where is that strategy or policy that you're now saying that, okay, China is now a different player in Asia? It's something that we're going to have to now deal with with a more complex foreign policy. But where is your China policy in all this, right? I mean, it's a bit like of a sulk in some sense. It does seem so. So I think that is something where we are beginning to sort of feel we aren't still facing the consequences of that. But at some stage, if we go on like this, in this very tactical kind of way, we are not going to be able to fully flourish and develop a role in Asia. So I think that is where this idea of a new equilibrium, of course, this is not to suggest that we are the cause of the problem with China. I mean, we may play some part, but the main problem is China's rise is now just changing the entire power equation and the dynamic with India. So how do you respond to it? My book lays out a framework, a dual framework. That is, you have to have a balance of power strategy where you have strong ties with all China's neighbors and the great powers like the United States and Russia, which we are doing. But that by itself won't be enough. You still have to have some sort of a strategic realpolitik engagement with China. You can't wish that away. So that parallel track where you have engagement and it's supplemented by a broader set of partnerships should give you the space, the bargaining space, the confidence to at least move forward on certain areas. But and when it comes to your core problems, those are something like, let's say, the border dispute. I don't think we as a country and as a people have still fully accommodated ourselves to say that we're ready to solve this question, right? When we started this discussion, we spoke about the possibilities of a settlement in 1960, the late 70s, early 80s. Are we ready today, even if, let's say, theoretically, those possibilities were to reappear? I'm not so sure, right? I mean, we often tell ourselves in small groups that we're ready, but are all the political formations in India going to come together and find that consensus? I don't think so. So I think that is where we are stuck in this our own thing, that we can't solve these problems. So what is the alternative then? You have to deal with the reality that you exist. So you ask the question, what will be this equilibrium? There is no doubt that there's going to be competition and rivalry. I think where the nuances lie across this debate on China policies, what will be the intensity of that competition? Will it take on a Cold War style? Will it take on an ideological identity conflict? Will it be pan-Asian, or will it focus on? So my argument is going to be a little more subtler than that, for the simple reason that India, for two reasons, in fact. One, India and China do not have a civilizational struggle, right? There's no identity conflict. This is a conflict, or this is a competition over power, proximity, insecurity, security, right? That's the main essence of it. You can add on norms and ideas and values, but I think the essence is geography and geopolitics. So if we can find a way to manage the proximity, or this sort of several thousand kilometers of a frontier where Indians and Chinese militaries are now eyeball to eyeball, if we can find a way to calm that down, stabilize it. I think when it comes to third parties like the neighborhood, that competition can be a bit more sophisticated, because India's neighbors are not necessarily relishing India-China competition, right? They don't want it to go beyond a certain point. They benefit with strong ties with both, something that we try and do at the global level. They're emulating that. So the equilibrium will be something where you will have competition, you will have collaboration, you will have a long dispute, which has been there for 70 years. It may last another 70 years, who knows? So you're going to have to have a complex China policy. And in that sense, the argument that the last year has shown that you got to have something completely new, I'm not sure what that completely new is. It cannot but be a part of the past sort of ideas that you've had in dealing with China, that you're going to have a complex China policy. But yes, the idea of the asymmetry with China, where you've been left behind across the metrics of comprehensive national power, I think that's something you've got to have to deal with internally. That if you do not bounce, that if India does not bounce back in the next decade in a more sustainable growth model, a model which values science, technology, innovation, and truly develops itself internally, then I'm afraid the problems of India, China will be of a very different magnitude. That is, you've been left behind. And the idea of competition becomes a non-starter then in 20, 30 years, right? Because then you're going to have to live in a world order where you're more or less going to have to accept the rules that are around you and perhaps in a very, very narrow sense pursue security. So I think the challenge for India is very domestic. It's internal. It's the challenge that China faced in the late 70s, that how are you going to manage living in a world where you have the first world that has got enormous resources, technology, and political strength. And to match them, you're going to have to modernize and reform at home. So I think we are at that stage where what is our reforms and modernization going to look at?
Very well said. I mean, very interesting points that you made. I mean, whether we have a public opinion which is very supportive of the political will, or what is that political will, whether all the parties are going to unite and think about the China policy, what is that policy all about? I mean, these are the questions which India really needs to address, and that is how we can really deal with China. And probably this competition is definitely going to be there, but it all depends upon the next decade, 2-3 decades, how we are going to, progress in terms of modernity. With these words, I mean, it was very interesting to have a discussion with you, listen to you. A really, really great pleasure for me. Personally, as well as on our channel as well. And I hope we'll continue our interactions. Thank you very much. To our viewers, please keep watching and keep listening to our programs. Thank you very much. Namaste.